This is where I live in Melbourne, not exactly where I live because people don't get paid at the University of Melbourne well enough to live in the high-rise apartments in the centre of the city, but the university is located just north of the CBD, and it's a lovely place to live and to visit. This is where I work. The buildings themselves, they obviously, Australia being a British colony and the universities being established in the image or the model of the British universities, they tried to make it look as much as they could like an old university in the UK. But that's the building I work at, the Elizabeth Murdoch building, which is part of the Rupert Murdoch family empire donations to the University of Melbourne. And I just thought to just mention this is the building of the Melbourne Institute for Applied Economics and Applied Economic Research, or it's called the Melbourne Institute. It's a very reputable economics research centre at the University of Melbourne, and I have some good friends that have worked there, and I'd strongly recommend if you are to be interested in coming to Australia to do economics research, that would be one of the first places to get into contact with, and they're very international. I'd say most people there are not Australians. So the other couple of points I wanted to make is that there is an Endeavour Fellowship scheme from the Australian government for foreign citizens to come and spend time for their PhD or other sorts of research to Australia. Just last year we had a PhD student from Poland, an economist, come and stay in our centre for perhaps 6 months, and my relations with him, I meant that now that I've applied for research funding from our research council, I'll look to hire him in some capacity to help me with my research, because I was so impressed with what his approach to higher education research from an economics point of view. The other point is I've received previously funding from the Erasmus Mundus program, or Erasmus Plus. I see that there's some logos in the back of the room. Be aware of that, because there's quite a lot of funding from the European Commission to help people go to Europe and study or do further research. As I said, I'm from the University of Melbourne. I've been there since 2011. I've only recently completed my PhD, 2015, so unlike the professors, I can't really claim to be an expert in too many things. I'm here just to learn and to present my research and to learn from you about the academic profession in other countries. Prior to the University of Melbourne, I worked at the Nordic Institute for Studies in Innovation, Research and Education. That's where I was supervised for my master thesis, which I did as an Erasmus Mundus program in Norway, Finland and Portugal. I've got quite a few different universities where I've studied and got degrees from, and currently I'm Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Higher Education Policy and Management. I started that this year, and from my experience it seems that as Editor-in-Chief I can do whatever I want. So most submissions that come in I desk reject, but I have complete editorial control, and I can publish things. So if there's a research topic that's of relevance to our primary readership, which is higher education managers and policy makers, primarily from I guess most of our audience is Australasian, maybe North European and North American, it's a potential journal to think about. It's in Scopus, and it should become part of the Web of Science perhaps in the next few years. It's on the interim list. So today I'll talk about differentiation within the academic profession and this whole two-stage career model, which, to give a brief account for it, it's how people progress from primarily insecure employment arrangements where they are to demonstrate their competence or develop their competence under close supervision, towards more secure, tenured type ongoing arrangements where they can pursue disinterested research, long-term research, without fear that their results may not lead to the publications that are so essential in the early career stages. I'll use present a theoretical framework of this, and then this theoretical framework included 3 different countries. I'll add in the Australian academic profession, or my interpretation of that. I'll make a brief comment on the Russian academic profession. Perhaps that could be something that we can discuss further, or even as a further further sort of discussion paper whereby we can see how can we frame the Russian academic profession within this two-stage career model framework, and finally some future directions. So any research on the academic profession must start with the question of, well, who are we actually talking about when we're talking about academics? And one of the first large-scale studies of the academic profession was in the United States in the 1940s by Professor Logan Wilson. And at the time he faced the same challenges that I do, in that there are some people which we would include, some people we wouldn't, some institutions we would include, some institutions we would not consider worthy of inclusion into the academic profession, and disciplines as well. And this is a bit of I think quite a ridiculous statement, but he needed to make the statement that a professor may be a secondary school teacher, an instructor in a barbering college, or a business school, with the note being that this is a very derogative statement, that it could even include people in business schools, or quack psychologists, or circus barkers. I did have to look this one up. I wasn't sure what a circus barker is, but it's someone that stands out the front of a circus and yells to the crowd to come in and see the freak shows. Or even a piano player in a house of prostitution. I don't want to go there to know what professors are involved in that sort of work. But these definitions do change over time, and we have to make our decisions about who we are to include. And in the studies which I've been part of, which are international comparative studies, it's increasingly important to know who you're including in different countries, so that you're making some kind of apples with apples comparisons, rather than some kind of apples and bananas and rotten fruit and a few vegetables thrown into it. So to think about how we define the academic profession, traditionally it's about work roles, and work roles being at least since the German university, the Humboldtian approach to structuring universities came in the 1800s, it's been about the combination of teaching and research. So research institutes would not be considered, people staffing there may not be considered academics, even if they hold the professor title, or teaching focused staff are often not included. Institutional types, not just separating out research only institutions, but also two-year colleges in the United States may not be considered part of the academic profession's realm of control. And even within the university sector, there may be differences between institutional types, those that have strong research missions and those who have research missions as a symbolic claim to be a university. Contract types are, again, about whether someone has got any sort of long-term commitment to working in universities. There are lots of people who are only on short hourly contracts. And this correlates, of course, with academic rank, because they tend to be both in the lower academic ranks and perhaps hold part-time status. Finally, perhaps a quintessential definition of the academic profession and their work is that they do it in a somewhat autonomous basis. It's academics complain a lot, and they have the right to complain and complain about their management and so forth, and be really quite insubordinate. And that's something which I guess is coming under pressure, as there are fewer positions which hold the sort of job security, and in many systems, perhaps like in Russia, there's also this strong tradition of patronage and dependence on the chairs. But in other systems, there's certainly a right to complain and moan about how things are, and not fear that you might lose your job in the process. There are professional norms which come originally from what they call Robert Merton's or Mertonian norms of science. These are perhaps how academics pursue primarily their research, but also their teaching, which makes them different from, say, consultancy firms or contract research in government. And that is these five, well, they were extended by Zimmern to include five. Communalism means that the knowledge that's produced by academics ought to be available to all that seek it. It shouldn't be held behind a paywall, although that's of course something which is very common these days, or restricted from access for certain people. Universalism means that it doesn't matter who pursued the research, it doesn't matter that I may not have a PhD, or I have a PhD, or hold whatever title, or even if I'm not employed as an academic, if my research can make a particular claim, it should be my research that's held to critique, not me as a person. Disinterestedness, I think, is probably the core one, I think, which is a defining characteristic. That is that we ought to be able to pursue our research without having personal benefits or negative consequences associated with the research outcomes. So if the research says that the Australian academic profession is in crisis, then that should be something that I should be able to publish without, if that's what the data says, then I should be able to publish that without fear that my career will be negatively impacted. Or perhaps, on the other hand, if I say it's in crisis, I shouldn't be saying that, because by making a big crisis about the academic careers in Australia, it somehow benefits my career because I get to lobby for more funding from government. John's got a question.
Are you going to talk about the fact that today increasingly a large fraction of the humanities and social sciences explicitly reject disinterestedness? So many of the critical groups in sociology, literature, and history in the United States actually face things like the job of the humanities is to advance certain ideals, or I've talked to professors who sort of say, for example, even if there were biological data showing that oppressed peoples are in some way less successful or less able, we should repress that for if it could be used to increase oppression.
Look, I'm not going to specifically talk about the impacts of holding back data that, from what you're saying, sounds perhaps politically incorrect to put forward. But of course, this is one of the core themes of why I would be saying that disinterestedness is one of the norms which is under greatest threat, because people can be silenced, or they can find that their research isn't published and that has implications for their careers. Or increasingly, our research funding may come from contract research from government, and there are all sorts of consequences that we ought not be concerned about if we're pursuing disinterested research. But in practice, we know that even the simple things about if your research has statistically significant results, it's more likely to be published than if your research finds that there's no particular relationship. Even if that particular hypothesis that there is a relationship ought to be rejected, we find lots of, there are those more subtle and the more overt reasons why disinterestedness is coming under threat. Originality, I think, is self-explanatory. Skepticism is just that you shouldn't take what I say as being true. You should treat it with a dose of skepticism and look at and question the data and the rationale behind my claims. Okay, the academic profession is frankly not a single profession. It's differentiated along a number of lines, and one of the primary ones is along disciplinary lines. We could argue that it's a profession of professions, in that we've got people from law who are both attached to a professional, regulated profession as a lawyer, who are teaching in the law faculty, and we've got philosophers, physicists, and it's very unlikely that academics will move between disciplines. If my contract's not renewed in the social sciences and some position comes up in physics, I'm of course not going to be able to apply and move into become a physicist overnight. I'm much more likely to move to another institution within my discipline, or even into another country within my discipline, than across disciplinary boundaries. And one of the more thought-provoking and well-cited books is the book Academic Tribes and Territories by the late Tony Beecher and Paul Trowler. And they talk about, from a sociological perspective, how there's different languages and territories that disciplines hold. And for example, we may have, I'm in an education faculty, yet I'm also in higher education, and we have our ground, which is quite different to the pedagogical research that's done in education. We have economists that come in and do economics-based research on higher education. We have psychologists that come in and do their research on early childhood education. And these theoretical and methodological approaches are often in often in flux and people competing for the right to make claims within certain disciplines. The secondary axis, and this is Burton Clark, another passed away academic who wrote one of the more influential initial books in 1983 on the higher education system, and he talked a lot about the institutional framework whereby the higher education sector is governed differently for research intensive universities versus those less intensive institutions and polytechs and colleges. And he also talked about it as a type of matrix of differentiation between the institutional type. Now this is coming also from a bit of a North American perspective in that they have graduate schools versus undergraduate and community colleges and so forth. The institutional dimension would have far less relevance in a country like, even a country like Australia where we have a unitary system, we don't have polytechs, or in Sweden where perhaps all universities carry the same prestige and access to research funding. But the idea from his book, The Academic Life, is that any claims about what academics do must be very carefully framed within the discipline and institutional type that you're talking about. So if we say that the chances of the amount of time we spend teaching undergraduates, we spend 60% of our time teaching undergraduates, that claim needs to be framed within, well, that was a study of physicists within research intensive universities or economists in less intensive universities. That framework of this matrix was, even when it was just discussed in the 1980s and early 90s, it had a pretty fundamental flaw in that it didn't recognise how there's this internal hierarchy within each discipline and institutional types, whereby junior academics have different sorts of tasks and responsibilities and experiences compared to their more senior colleagues, and in some ways junior academics, in my case perhaps in education or political science, share many things in common with their junior academics in physics, in that we face similar pressures from job insecurity and dependence on senior academics and lack of research funding. Was that, John, did you raise your hand? No, okay. So this was somewhat extended upon by Jürgen Enders and Christine Musselan, talking about an internal hierarchy, and others, other researchers from North America and Hong Kong, Glenn Jones, Philip Altbach and Bruce McFarlane, started talking about how we've got a vertical segregation, or we've got this academic underclass, these highway academics in the USA who are not really part of the academic profession and who struggle to, who don't really fit into these frameworks of when we're talking about claims around what academics do. And McFarlane is also introducing how academic work and what we would call professional staff or non-academics, it's starting to get quite blurred, whereby we have research support staff and lab technicians that are really contributing to the research within the universities, and we've got increasing numbers of people with PhDs moving into these sorts of jobs, partly in Australia at least because those jobs are more secure, and perhaps some may even have more time for research if they're not actually employed as an academic, and they have this continuity of employment that's available to them. But there is certainly some. We've also got senior academics moving into management positions, so that they hold their professor salary and then get subsequent loadings or increases in order to be a manager of a faculty. Finally, there's the international comparative dimension, and that's where a lot of my research has come in, where you've got academics, junior academics in particular disciplines, or senior academics who perhaps they're part of a more international labour market as well. Perhaps it's my conditions of employment are influenced by how many PhDs are produced in the UK or in Germany, and the academic work conditions over there. Musalan is, who I'll speak about in more detail than the others, is certainly on the side where the academic profession must be understood as a national academic labour market, not an international one. Simon Marginson at the University of London is somewhat more nuanced in his argument, saying that there's an elite that are part of an international labour market, and perhaps he is one of the elite. He's a prolific publisher. He left our centre at the University of Melbourne to go to the University of London, presumably because, well, he made it quite clear that he wasn't too satisfied with the amount of time he had available for research at the University of Melbourne. So for some people there is an international labour market. John Meyer, an institutional theorist, is probably at the more extreme, where he makes claims that professors carry the status of rabbis and priests and can travel the world and have mutual recognition and well understood. If we look at what professors do and with their time and their levels of output and the level of prestige and reputation they have, it does certainly vary depending on the academic system. But certainly there are some claims that a professor is a professor and can go within their discipline and travel around the world. Hey, I mean, I'm here talking to you today, so there is certainly an international dimension to it. So when Musalan was talking about the market for academics, she differentiated between internal markets and external markets. And what she was interested in looking at is how do people get into the academic profession after their PhD? How do they gain security? How do they get promoted to professorship? How do they get more money? And this is where there was an introduction of a two-stage career process. She looked at 3 different countries, 3 very important ones, the USA, France and Germany, and differentiated between where there's external competitive criteria whereby people compete for a limited number of jobs, which tends to happen for the first stage of the academic career, but also in certain countries there's people can't move to professorship unless there's a vacant professorship available, and then everyone competes for the limited number of spots. In other countries it's done through internal criteria, meeting the expectations of what a professor ought to have done, and you don't need to move to another, there doesn't need to be a vacant position. This can be done through an informal internal review process, or in other countries it may involve external review so that the decision made at your university meets the same criteria or some similar criteria to other universities within the same country. So there are certain criteria that she would say that indicate whether there's external competition or whether it's done through informal means. And like I say, she developed a framework where she asked, through sociological research in those 3 countries, quite narrow, but looking at how does this occur? How are decisions made in these panels of academics when they receive a bunch of applications for promotion, or they're trying to recruit someone into the academic profession? How is it that they rank how do they come up with their rankings of candidates? So from that, Musalan and Enders wrote a paper which developed some typologies for 2-stage academic careers in these 3 countries. And again, the idea moving from how does someone move from primarily insecure first stage positions into the more secure and independent second stage. And the whole point of insecurity in the first stage is actually, it's not correct, in that one of the countries, France, has security from the very beginning. So it's the French system, how it's been structured, has come from Napoleonic times, whereby there's the disciplines themselves were organised somewhat independently of any central university framework, and there was a separation of the grand écoles, sorry for my French, and weak institutional integration within the universities within each of those universities. The most important point being that they held civil servant status, so civil servants tend to have job security, and they gain job security from a very early stage. So to get into the academic profession in France, it can be a combination of informal or internal recruitment or external, but the main thing is that they describe it as a protective pyramid, in that there's a pyramidal structure you move. You can move at any stage you wish. Well, you need to apply for promotion, but you can move up from the junior positions up to full professorship without any forced mobility or external review. And the downside the reason why this two-stage process has come under threat in France is that there's been a lack of recruitment into junior positions. In fact, the numbers have declined in recent years, and that may be partly because the financial implications of hiring people who are likely to progress up to professorship means that universities don't have the money to hire people on this traditional career track. So more and more people are being hired outside this protective pyramid. Germany has its own tradition for structuring the academic profession, whereby there's from the history of Wilhelm von Humboldt's restructuring of universities to integrate teaching and research. It also gave strong power to the chairs of each discipline. So each discipline might have one single professor, which controls all of the recruitment of PhDs and junior academics within their discipline in their university, as opposed to other countries, certainly like in France, where there can be any number of professors within a discipline. They just need to meet a certain criteria to get promoted. So this creates a very steep hierarchy in the German system, but there's also a couple of unique features whereby German academics, before they can even consider applying for a vacant professorships, they must complete their sort of second PhD, which I understand that Russians are familiar with. And there's also a forced mobility, so you cannot gain your professorship in the same institution where you started your academic career. The problems that the German academic profession has faced in recent times has again been this expansion at the bottom, but there's only so many professorships that are available, and those positions are funded by the state governments, and the state governments, you can't have another professorship without the secure funding coming from those sources. So they simply haven't seen enough of an expansion at the top in order to account for all of this growth at the bottom. So you have a whole lot of churn at the bottom, people on insecure contracts for a very long time. So if you can imagine someone entering the French academic labour market, they finish their PhD, they may do a postdoc or they may not do a postdoc, but their first academic position will be secure with this clear pathway to the top. In Germany, even under the traditional system, there was never a clear pathway to professorship. Something had to come up, and you'll be competing quite heavily for those limited positions. It's a very competitive, or a contest, or a tournament type approach for gaining the first academic position as well as the subsequent professorship. The USA, the other country examined by Musalan and Enders, has its own tradition. It's a state-based system, so we can't, as opposed to France, which is quite federal, and has its unique departmental structures. So as you could say, it's somewhat more democratic in its decision-making process, whereby there's no single chair that will wield complete power over their discipline. There's a much stronger role for presidents, university presidents, to structure their institutions and their missions in their own way. So the professors themselves don't hold all of the decision-making power like you would have under a type of academic oligarchy in Germany. And this is Johns Hopkins and Johns Hopkins University, and I think the first president of Johns Hopkins University. And Johns Hopkins University is mentioned because it was so heavily structured based on the German academic model. Prior to Johns Hopkins University's establishment in around the mid-1800s, universities still held a very strong practical teaching orientation in the USA, and this introduced introduced research. What makes, of course, the US academic profession unique is that it has this tenure track, which it's quite peculiar that such a decentralized system has established something which you would find in private institutions and public institutions across many states. But perhaps the main thing to take from the American academic profession is that a lot of effort is put into the recruitment of the first stage academics on the tenure track, because when a professor is to retire and the department is looking to recruit, they're looking to recruit someone who will one day be a professor. They're not just looking to recruit someone who can fill the teaching gap today, who's conveniently located around the cohorts of PhDs. Yes, John?
So if I may comment, then the US is unusual and it actually has a three-stage system, because there's a large fraction of professors who are non-tenure track, but who have a chance of entering the first stage. So it's the only one which has this huge pre-first tier, so it's really a third tier.
So do you mean that...
the vast majority of, say, humanities professors do not get a tenure track appointment, even after a PhD.
Yes. And that's what I will say is the decline of the two-stage process in the USA, whereby there's been this massive growth in non-tenure track, adjunct teaching positions, and people needing to first prove themselves in that market before they can even hope to gain a tenure track position. And then the tenure track position does not, of course it does not guarantee that someone will get to the second stage and have ongoing employment. And it's actually quite odd to me that when I examined what proportion of people move from the first stage on the tenure track make it to tenure, there's actually not that much clear research. The research that I've found is based on single institutions looking at the proportion of a cohort that make it 6 years later. And at least I can say what I've seen at Penn State, it's around about 50% of the tenure track get through, but of course this would depend also on the selectiveness of the entry into the tenure track. At other institutions they may have be less selective in who they recruit, but then cut a whole lot more before they make it to the top. Yes, John.
And if I make one more correction, you mentioned the state-based system, but I think merely by saying that, I think you're missing the uniqueness of the American system. Notice you mentioned it's a state-based system, but your example is Johns Hopkins, which is a private university. What's unusual about the American system is the state-based systems follow the private systems. Almost all the norms in the American university system were determined by the elite private universities. And then state universities account for the majority of tenure track professors. But most of these norms of behavior and standards are established by the elites. So like the Ivy League or Stanford or MIT or Chicago. So that's, I think, what's different. And Johns Hopkins is a very good example of that. So that the states have to play catch up or they will lose all their faculty to the private school.
Okay, I'll take that point. Perhaps I'll move on to what I see as the Russian model from what I've read from Maria and Yudkovich and others. It appears that I'm not entirely sure if there's a first stage and second stage and what role external markets play in Russia, because on the one hand, people are recruited on limited term contracts and have no guarantees of ongoing employment, and advertised positions by implication mean that there should be some kind of external application and competition for those positions. But in practice, we see this temporary status of 3-year contracts in the first stage, leading to sort of de facto permanence, whereby people have their contracts renewed and there's a strong patronage. It's almost an artificial type market for and competition for academics. It's certainly holds some similarities to the German system, whereby the first stage is about developing competence under the strong guidance of the research professors, the chairs, and of course there's the habilitation, but it doesn't have this requirement that people move from the institution where they first take their first academic job to another institution in order to gain the professorship or chair. But that's something we can discuss further. I know, oh boy, I don't know how this happened. That's kind of stuffed up my presentation. It's lost the labels when I emailed the PowerPoint slide. But what I've listened to some presentations earlier this week which talked about enforced academic mobility, and whether mobility is a good thing or whether inbreeding is a bad thing. What this slide was to show was across a range of countries the proportion of industry experience individual academics report throughout their career versus the opposite being experience that they've had since their PhD working in academia. So some countries recruit more academics with industry experience, and how many institutions an academic on average has spent their time at throughout their career. From memory, you'll have, I'll have to find a better way to represent this because I have lost the cell ranges, but this has lost everything except the USA. But the point here is that if we take a survey from the early 1990s and compare it with a survey from the late around 2008, in all countries except Brazil, which is a peculiar exception but shouldn't be discussed in great detail. I see the UK's there as well. There's been a shift towards more academic mobility and less industry experience. So academics typically become far more specialised in academic careers, but there's a greater need for, on average, they've spent more time at more institutions. That's more of a comment on an international trend in the academic profession, except the reason why Brazil is an exceptional case is because of the extreme number of people who are on part-time contracts who must work in multiple institutions and have different careers. Yes.
Should we see this as less stress on industry, or as all universities around the world moving to the same model? Because I see this one at the bottom there going up, so it seems that so more than less industry, it seems that they're all merging to the same kind of little circle. So it seems to be some kind of convergence, except maybe Brazil and the other guys. So is it less industry or convergence to one spot in the matrix?
Yeah, it's a good point. I wouldn't want to. I guess the main thing to see, as you're right, is that there's a stress towards more mobility rather than perhaps less industry experience. But if we had the Australia is this one here, which came from quite high to quite low, and even though our government and many other governments are stressing we need more industry collaboration and more industry relevance for our staff and more industry experience from our academics, that's not translating into recruiting people who have more industry experience. In fact, the barriers to entry in most countries are far greater because you now need industry experience, but that doesn't get away from the requirements of, well, you don't need, if you're given the choice, are they going to recruit someone with an esteemed research track record versus someone who has industry experience. Many universities in competitive systems want to move up rankings, and they'll choose the eminent professor over the industry expert 9 times out of 10. So the Australian academic profession is somewhat based on the UK model. We don't have tenure. We have ongoing contracts for some staff, we have limited term contracts, and we have casual contracts. Casual contracts are hourly based contracts. Now, traditionally, it would be a type of protective pyramid, whereby people finished their PhD, or perhaps they didn't finish their PhD, but they got a first stage position, a lecturing position, involved in teaching and research. They progressed, they finished their PhD, and they moved up the internal ranks. They said, okay, I've got my PhD, I should be promoted from assistant to lecturer. I've done some research, I should be promoted to senior lecturer. And then through experience, I've accumulated a track record of teaching and research, so you need to promote me to full professorship. So there's no requirement for mobility. There often is mobility because some of the internal criteria are more bureaucratic and difficult than simply applying for a vacant position at a higher rank at a different university and then using that as a bargaining chip to get internal promotion. But this is the way in which the profession was traditionally structured in Australia. What's happened since around the mid-1990s is that there's been a complete separation from teaching and research. So you've got a far greater number of teaching-only staff and research-only staff, and far fewer staff recruited into the teaching and research functions. The teaching-only staff, about 90% are on, or let's say 85% would be casual, which is on an hourly based contract. You can be told at the end of the day, or even not the end of the day, don't come in tomorrow. There's no access to paid leave or sick leave. You're sick, you don't get paid. That's around 85% of our teaching-only staff are on those sorts of arrangements, with the remaining, around 10% are on more ongoing and 5% fixed-term contracts. Now, it's a precursor to the vast majority of people on teaching and research contracts spent some time on teaching-only contracts. So it's a type of prerequisite position in order to get into the teaching and research positions. But now that we're not recruiting very many teaching and research positions, you've got people spending a lot longer time. They may still, even though they're hourly based contracts, many people are employed for many years, 5, even up to around 8 years of contracts which last for one semester to the next. So informal recruitment, no opportunity for promotion. Research only, it's often they're recruited, advertised, but sometimes not. There's an opportunity to, the vast majority of these, about 90%, are on limited term contracts with no expectation for ongoing employment, but there is an opportunity to move even up to a full research professor position without having any teaching experience. The problem is that in order to get the time it takes to demonstrate your research, you don't without the ongoing security of employment, it's hard to get promoted up. And if you get promoted, you may find that you don't keep your job because you then cost more money than the funding which your projects are bringing in. You need to keep bringing as much funding to cover your own higher salary now. But what we do find are people who are eminent in their research output in teaching and research move into research professor positions for a period of time until they may win a grant from the Research Council. So to demonstrate the role fragmentation in Australia, there has been some growth in teaching and research positions. This is full-time equivalent data, but the growth hasn't been as strong as in research only or in the teaching only functions. And certainly in recent years it's been flat. And this is to demonstrate the different contract types. I may have misquoted, but 74% of teaching and research staff are ongoing, primarily a legacy of the recruitment into the teaching and research positions in the 90s and early 2000s. 85% of staff like myself are in research-only positions or on fixed-term contracts, and yeah, around 90% or 82% in casual teaching only. The one peculiar outcome of, well, it's not peculiar, but often not recognised outcome of having a strong internal internal promotion system without the need for external review. You can be promoted from all the way up within the same institution, is that those positions in level D and E, which are your associate and full professor positions, have seen the greatest growth in the last 15 years. So even though we've had massive growth in our teaching only casual staff, and the teaching only staff, it really underestimates the number because they're on a full-time equivalent basis. So that if you're paid 10 hours a week, then that's 1/4 of an FTE. But people paid to teach 10 hours or for 10 hours of teaching per week often spend double the amount of time actually doing the teaching. So it grossly underestimates at the bottom, but nevertheless, in terms of what's being paid, it's at the very top that we've seen the greatest growth. And their second greatest growth is at the very bottom, and the middle ranked positions are few and far between. And to give some understanding of just how expensive it can be for Australian universities, this is in US dollars, and showing the postdoctoral salaries for academics in Victorian universities. And I'm sorry, it's the font colour hasn't worked very well here, but at University of Melbourne, the minimum a postdoc could be, or anyone with a PhD could be paid, is $67,000 a year. That's the highest paid across all institutions in Victoria, and this is roughly the same pattern in all states, because there's a single academic labour union who negotiate agreements with each.
Peter, as a Belgian, is this gross or net?
This is before tax, yeah.
Okay.
But Australia's taxation system is not as high as in Belgium or in...
That's why I'm asking.
Yeah.
For us, it would be like half it, right?
Yeah, well...
Not like it, half it.
Yeah, well, in Australia, you might take 25% off the total.
Okay.
For, obviously, with progressive taxation, you take more for a full professor. So the top being full professor, you can see the gap between associate and full professor is quite a big jump. These are the ranges for professors who enter in. This is actually the minimum you can be paid at each rank. But full professors at Melbourne get close to 140 something thousand US dollars plus. Plus they tend to have ongoing employment, which means that they get paid more into their pension fund, which is 17%, as opposed to people on other forms of contract who are on 9%. So whereas we might expect professions where there would be a trade-off, you trade off benefits for higher salary and less job security, in Australia we find that greater job security, higher pay, better benefits are all they're all highly correlated amongst themselves, and less teaching as well. So it's quite a problem, but the other main point to take here is that there's very few differences from your elite universities down to a regional-based Federation University in Ballarat. And most of those differences are actually overstated, because Melbourne's just had its pay increase in its collective agreement, and the lowest paid one, Victoria University, is going to get its one later in the year. I think this is the final slide, and this is just showing 30% of all people in the bottom academic ranks, each year there's a turnover. So lose their job in some way or leave their job, whereas it's only around 9% at the top, and most of which is voluntary. So professors moving to other positions or professors potentially retiring. The orange being also voluntary. This is like if the university says we need to make redundancies, jobs need to disappear, we're not going to force anyone. And this tiny sliver is forced redundancies, or sackings, you could say, and it's far less than 1% of the academic workforce. So it creates a type of de facto tenure, because universities, if they need to manage their budgets and they're facing a deficit, they'll simply not renew contracts. They won't look at going through quite a drawn-out process to make someone redundant, even though they could, and it would be a lot easier than in other systems like in Germany or certainly in the US. The people managing the budgets are often professors, and they'll tend to simply not renew contracts.
So what category do they fall under, as in if my contract doesn't get renewed? Is it voluntary, is it involuntary?
No, fixed term contract expiration.
Okay.
But it masks an important problem whereby if I know my contract's not going to be renewed, I will leave. I will start looking for jobs and I'll start looking 6 months, maybe even a year before my contract's expiring if I'm in doubt. And it's completely wasteful of our time we spend a lot of time looking for other jobs, even though there's a good chance your contract's going to be renewed. Because you don't know, you'll be looking at other jobs. So the actual involuntary turnover due to the fixed term contract expiration is I think understated. So I'll just leave with some discussion points about how does the lack of security in academic careers affect, say, the attractiveness of the academic profession. Australia doesn't have such a problem because the current exchange rates mean that I think for $67,000 US a year, we can quite easily find someone, a PhD from the USA, to take those postdoc positions, or professorships paying $140,000 plus 70% superannuation plus offices and so forth, and research funding and so forth. I don't think with this current, being an English-speaking country, it's such an issue for us, but it does, I think, affect the academic norms, the sorts of research that people pursue. I need to get something published so that I can be more sure that my contract will be renewed. I need to get funding for my research, so I need to propose something which I think the Research Council or the government is willing to fund. And so it shapes the sorts of research I do. The quality of teaching is an interesting one. We've looked at whether the growth in casual, limited term, primarily hourly based contracts in teaching in disciplines within universities relates to the student satisfaction on the quality of teaching reported within that same university compared to, so if you can imagine natural sciences or physics students, the rates of casualisation in physics in a given university relative on a scatter plot relative to either student satisfaction with the quality of teaching or dropout rates, and there's no pattern. So one of the problems for any advocates to say we need to provide more job security on the basis that it affects the quality of teaching is that we don't have any data that shows that institutions that have high rates of casualisation have higher rates of dropouts or lower rates of reported quality of teaching or satisfaction from their students. And so we kind of have a theory that, but we're searching for, people are searching for data to confirm that theory, which of course is bad research. But what it seems is that all of this extra time that casual academic teachers put into their research and their genuine commitment to teaching and their hope for an academic career and their dependence of doing a good job means that the quality of teaching hasn't declined in Australia. I don't know if it's temporary or permanent, this shift, whether this cohort, as these old baby boomers on good contracts retire, the universities will start to have some more money in which to provide job security. We've had a decentralisation of budgets down to the departmental levels. So if you can imagine, if each university in Australia is quite wealthy, but each department has to manage their own budget, and departments are facing much more risk because their student number fluctuations, they can't rely on the growth if their numbers go down because education is no longer as popular as business, they have to manage that fluctuation within their own department. And this has been a conscious decision of Australian universities. And finally, I don't know whether the situation in Australia can be generalised. I think other countries, the UK has certainly followed a lot of Australia's leads on these things, recruiting research professors in order to bump up the research output, improve that in order to improve rankings and so forth. Perhaps in some instances our situation can be generalised, but I'm not so sure. So that's the final slide, I believe. Yeah, I've got a thank you slide, but let's leave it on the discussion points, and I'll be happy to take questions now or later.
During your presentation, you had the focus on teaching, but what about research in particular? What are the rules in Australia about funding research? It means you have a position with teaching and research, but do you have to submit a proposal to get funds for your research, or your position is comes with you know, a sort of pocket of funds for your research, because that is also relevant in the
Absolutely.
choice, yeah.
So I'll just, I think, go back to this slide. If you're in a teaching and research position, you're guaranteed research time. Now, the amount of time that you get differs by university, and there is some management there that if you're not publishing research, you might get more teaching load, but you don't need to be applying for funding in order to do research. If you're in a research-only position, then it's completely dependent on you or the seniors bringing in the money for you to do your research. And there's cross-subsidisation that goes on. So we bring in a lot of revenue for teaching in business schools. That then goes into a pot that the Chancellery or the Central University control, which then provides internally competitive funding for people to go to conferences or do their research or within strategic priority areas of the university.
I think there is one more, I think, important point to add to your discussion point, which is what are the consequences for governance structure of this growth of insecurity? Because we all know that the shared governance model works only if professors have incentives to invest time and effort in screening and committees and making right decision about appointment, etc. But once we increase the number of people who are on the part-time contracts or short-term contracts, this model is not efficient anymore. What do you think about the perspective of this governance model for the future?
It's coming under huge strain in Australia. We have the highest rates of time spent on administrative work for those who are on regular contracts, because the growth has been in irregular contracts. So those professors, even though I might say that they're in pretty good positions, they spend a lot more time on committees, because maybe the research-only people who are only committed for the next year or the duration of their grant are just not interested in advising on curriculum or being involved in those sorts of activities. So certainly it creates also each within departments, or you have more centres and institutes which sort of manage themselves and want to just not engage with the university. They just want to keep their money and look after their own staff and simply not avoid as much administrative and service as they can, because they know that their employment depends on bringing in research funding, and this engaging with the university is not going to help with that.
I have a question about the long-run equilibrium. So I can see, if you do this kind of reform, starting from more security, it's easy to select the research professors because they have, in stable contracts, have had the ability to prove themselves, to do risky projects. Some of them work, some of them don't. The guys that succeed, they become the research professors. But now, and so at this time it will probably kind of work. But in the long run, if all the young people are on much more precarious projects and precarious statuses, is it not going to increase incremental research, marginal research, safer research?
Absolutely.
I'm not going to do this high-risk, crazy project that could pay or not. I will do something I know will get published, but it's like an addition to the model or an extra test of an existing model. And people will start doing this, competing just to survive. But in the long run, where will be the good research? And how will you determine who are the good research professors? So I wonder to what extent this is a very short-term kind of equilibrium, a partial equilibrium.
I think it is very short term, and there are some indicators that Australia as a country and our universities produce a lot of research, but we don't produce a lot of highly cited research, like huge output, so that helps with the rankings. And of course universities will aim to recruit highly cited individuals to, if they're a highly cited researcher according to Thomson Reuters or the Web of Science, then they'll very likely find a job in an Australian university. I've got an example in my second presentation of a Russian. But yeah, on average, the research I think is, it's not like, say, in Switzerland or in other parts of Europe where where they have this sort of breakthrough research coming through, and it's a real concern. On the other hand, Australia is still a desirable place, and I don't think that our universities really care that much about the development of people from the first stage onwards, because if they're wanting a professor, they can advertise and they can get a good one from the UK or Canada or Belgium. Yeah.
Thanks for presentation. It was one question about too much insecurity that is bad, but what about too much security? I mean that if you showed France, and if you look at French universities, I think not much French universities are among top, and for the last years I guess they lost their positions.
Yeah.
Why do French why they don't change their system, or they change it, or they don't care?
Yeah.
What about too much security?
Well, I can't really comment, I'm not an expert on France, but as a centralised system of civil servants, I imagine that it's bureaucratically quite difficult to change the policies for how to make someone redundant or to get rid of an underperforming professor. I know that in the USA they're bringing in things like post-tenure review, and as a way to address people who have got tenure and have not haven't met expectations in some way. I'm not sure where that's heading. So there has to be a balance, I think, between the insecurity in the first stage and the security in the later stage. The problem is that the decisions about who problem is that we're losing that link between the motivation that if I do my job very well, I will have another contract or I'll have further employment. It becomes a type of, I have no control over the research funding that comes into the university. If it comes in, it'll first go to pay for the professors' salaries, and then what's left will go to the people at the bottom. And that's very demotivating for planning for the future and for being motivated to produce another publication, because I struggle to see the link between my performance and my job security. On the other hand, that's the same problem for people who are on very secure employment, whereby the link between their salary and their job security doesn't necessarily relate to their performance. So we need to have perhaps less security in Australia, at least in those secure ongoing positions, and more security in the contracts whereby people can be committed. Let's say you're doing teaching and you're teaching microeconomics 101 or something, and there's fluctuation in the student numbers. And you do a good job, the universities ought to be in a position to say, well, we will guarantee that if we require teaching to be done in this field next year, if there are the students, you will keep your job. It'll only be if the numbers drop that you won't keep your job. The current situation is that the current situation is that someone can be replaced who's doing a very good job just because their contract has expired and the professors don't like that they complained about their contract. There needs to be this link between student numbers and revenue and further employment, but we should be able to guarantee that if someone's doing a decent job and there are students to be taught, that they're guaranteed that teaching load. And on the research side, it's a bit more tricky, but we should be committing to researchers so that if a project comes in that's slightly outside your expertise, we're still committed to training you up and giving you the time to become competent in that area and work on those projects, rather than your project ends and let's recruit someone else who can immediately work on the next project.
Is that this security is somehow balanced with more mobility in the Australian market? It means, do you observe mobility in thinking about this market of position among all the universities? Because that could be somehow a way to compensate this increasing in insecurity, in not secure places, jobs.
yeah, there's certainly more mobility because people are on these contracts and they need to be looking for other work, and it heavily promotes research. Like, I'll be much more motivated towards publishing research because it's through research that we are more mobile. Our research publications are recognised, whereas our contribution to the to the students in our department is not something, is a very private activity that other institutions would not be aware of. And we would probably have a lot of actual mobility, and then, like I say, we've got a lot of applications for jobs in other universities as a bargaining tool to get a promotion or another contract in your current institution. And then there's also a lot of, I've been at seminars at the University of Melbourne where they'll say, look, you know, Melbourne's the best university in the Southern Hemisphere. You do not want to move to anywhere else to take alternative academic work. And I think, well, you know, that's in your interest to be telling junior academics that mobility out of the research-intensive sector is bad for their career, when really we need to treat that more critically.
Okay, we have to stop here. I'm sorry.